Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the webinar today. My name is Stacy Chen. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Ekata. I work here alongside our product and market-facing teams to help bring the power of what we're doing behind data science and machine learning, especially in the Ekata Identity Network, to life for our customers. I'm also joined by Sarah Strano, Principal Solutions Architect. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Stacy said, my name is Sarah, and at Ekata, I help customers figure out how to best leverage our data, particularly in machine learning models. For example, recommending different features in their model or realizing when not to impute nulls as zeros.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Couple housekeeping items to cover just before we get started. Feel free to please put any questions as we're going along in the webinar console. We'll hold a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. And then just a heads up that a follow-up email will be sent out after the presentation with a link to the recording and slide deck as well. And today we'll be discussing what common fraud types we're seeing in the market and how the sophistication of attacks have really led to the use of emerging technologies, in particular machine learning and mining transactional patterns. These solutions are really key to providing companies predictive intelligence and helping them achieve tangible outcomes, whether that be increased fraud detection rates, reduced chargebacks, increased brand reputation, customer loyalty, and more. So for starters, we can go ahead and just move past the agenda. For starters, we're going to go ahead and invite you guys to participate in the conversation with us. The world is becoming increasingly reliant on digital, and as we mentioned earlier, fraud attacks are becoming more sophisticated. So we want to hear from you. What top fraud types are you seeing in your organization today? And we'll give you a couple minutes to fill that out. We'll give folks just a couple more seconds to fill out the poll here. Awesome. So it looks like 30% are seeing account takeover, 33% card testing, no promo abuse, so that's good, 15% synthetic ID, and then 17% other. Sarah, you work with a lot of our customers to kind of help solve these fraud problems. How does this compare with what you're seeing within the customer base that you work with?
I think that this is kind of along the lines of what we see a lot, that kind of account takeover and card testing kind of are leading, partly because I think that as the fraud landscape has matured, a lot of merchants have gotten a lot better at kind of catching kind of synthetic ID especially, but account takeover has definitely become like a unique problem.
Interesting. And as we look at just kind of the evolving fraud landscape, I pulled up kind of a couple quotes from things that I'd read previously. So I recently read in that Gartner report on the market guide for online fraud detection, the first quote on the slide here, just around how security and risk management leaders are really adopting techniques that focus on mining transactional patterns, detecting consumer experience abuses, and then really honing in on the identification process for fraudsters. And then I also read this quote on payments around how fraud rings really operate in these patterns and how Priceline specifically is using those patterns to help strengthen their machine learning. Sarah, have you seen a shift in kind of moving towards this transactional and behavioral pattern analysis with your customers? What are some of those common trends that you're seeing with customers when it comes to fighting fraud, whether it be account takeover or synthetic ID?
Yeah, so first of all, customers, whenever possible, are moving more towards machine learning. You can see that in the shift from rules-based to machine learning models, frequently with rules layered on top. In addition, we're seeing customers expanding outside of U.S. markets and into other English-speaking markets, and this has become a bigger and bigger trend. A lot of our customers, as they expand into a more global markets, are facing kind of some, different and unique fraud problems associated with kind of different geographies, with people, and in addition, with people's access to more and more of this global data. It's harder to make sense of kind of straightforward rules, and that's when machine learning can really help out, can help find those patterns that you may not know to look for as you're moving into new markets. In addition, as your data setting continues to grow, you become more reliant on both these models, but also having good data to input into the models. So good data validation and normalization becomes even more crucial.
Interesting. And you mentioned machine learning modeling quite a bit. So I'm kind of curious to open up back to the audience to see how many of our participants today are actually using machine learning in their fraud models. So let's go ahead and kick off that poll again. Let us know where you are in your fraud modeling journey, for better words, I guess, today. Okay, so looks like for those who responded, looks like they are using machine learning models in combination with rules today. So I think is that consistent with what you're seeing across your customer base, Sarah?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, whenever possible, people are moving more towards that kind of model. With that, you can kind of train a big machine learning model on your large global data set, but then tailor kind of those rules to more kind of transient fraud patterns. For example, if a few weeks ago you started noticing a certain trend coming from certain type of IP address from in a certain region, you can then create a rule on top of that model and say if a score is so-and-so and the IP address looks risky and it's in this geography, we automatically send this to manual review.
Okay. And I'm just curious, Sarah, like from your perspective, do you foresee there ever being like a pure machine learning model approach or kind of a hybrid of machine learning modeling and rules-based together?
I honestly think that there are certain merchants that use just machine learning model, but I think from a practical point of view, it's really, really helpful to kind of layer the two, just because you kind of get different advantages from each one. And like I said, one of the things that you can do, especially with the current technology stack that a lot of people use, is to train a model with some frequency, but then you can change those rules a lot more dynamically, and there's a lot more people at the company who have the ability to do that, just because it's hard for a data scientist to kind of come up with a new feature on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that. I know we've been talking a lot about fraud specifically, but I also read recently that companies are also concerned but also just considering using machine learning to provide a better customer experience. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on that, Sarah.
Yeah. So one thing, first of all, yes, you can. And if, customer experience is something that is really important, especially for a brand to kind of say, we treat our customers well. And if you're a good customer, you should keep coming back because we'll make the experience as seamless and as possible. We'll give you extra promotions. We'll treat you like you're a valued customer. I know that I definitely appreciate that. So one thing that we have noticed from a data perspective is that as companies are moving to kind of into this different fraud world, especially, they are moving their focus to figuring out how to determine if a customer is good enough from the time of onboarding. So not just to the transaction, but kind of when that person signs up for an account for the first time, what kind of customer do we think that they will be? And with that, they can, first of all, try to provide as frictionless of a customer experience when people are checking out as possible. And when people are onboarding, say at a marketplace, you can not ask for as many ID uploads, say, or other validation methods when they are pretty certain that this is a good customer. As they move kind of through this, that means that that merchants are basically looking to assess the value of a customer based on earlier in that account life cycle, which kind of allows them a lot more flexibility and also allows them to kind of tag that person from the beginning and build up kind of a data set about each individual.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying. It's not just the risk of a customer that you can assess, but also the value of that customer and how do you provide that personalized or customized experience for the customer after the fact once you know where their status is, for lack of better words.
Yeah, so that is super helpful. And like I said, so a lot of people are trying to assess risk early on in that customer life cycle, and then they will do a separate check, of course, when a transaction occurs, just to kind of see if the behavior is as kind of expected. And, there's also different value there because if you've been tracking a user for a certain amount of time and certain data points change, and those data points hadn't been associated with them before, that also can be concerning.
Interesting. So behavioral insights and mining transactional patterns can be used kind of both for good customers and then also bad customers as well.
Yeah.
And so can you talk some more, Sarah, about the approach that we take here with the identity network and kind of how identifying that good customer or bad customer plays into our approach with how we apply that machine learning to perform behavioral analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Stacy said, this is also why we take a specific approach to our identity network, which you can see on the right. We use our network, which is our data set of billions of online transactions provided by customers in conjunction with machine learning to perform behavioral analysis. We're not like consortiums in the industry where companies may blacklist or label identity elements as fraud, but our approach allows us to apply machine learning and identify the good and bad activity to tailor to our customer needs and use cases. So this is completely separate from our identity graph, which is on the left. And that comes from 100 plus authoritative sources where we use data science to curate, corroborate, and connect the links between the digital elements, such as email and IP, and physical, such as person or business name, phone, and address, attributes for identity resolution in our graph.
And I'm curious, Sarah, you mentioned consortiums. Do you mind unpacking that a little bit? What does it mean to have a consortium in the industry? And can you talk to the advantages and disadvantages of both?
Yeah, so a lot of the time what you see is a consortium will literally get some feedback from a customer that says, this set of identity elements were associated with a bad transaction. And they'll say, okay, this IP address is just bad. This email address is just bad. And that's a blacklist, right? You're adding a fixed identity element that's very specific to a list and saying this was associated with bad in the past, so it's likely to be associated with bad in the future. What we actually do is we look at the interactions between those elements and some other patterns that I'll discuss in a little bit more detail later to kind of help resolve that. So another way to look at this, just so that we're clear, is that our graph focuses on the linkages between identity elements using authoritative checks. So just looking at the phone number on the consumer, validating that it's real and who it belongs to, where a shopper's IP address originates from, who owns an email address. And I like to think of it as the graph helps verify who I am. For instance, my name is Sarah Strano. I live at XYZ address in Seattle. My phone number is, I'm not going to share it. Whereas the network tells me more about what I do and identifies what activity is consistent with versus anomalous or an outlier from typical buying behavior. So what we do is we come up with a set of features that are based over a bunch of different time slices. They look at velocity and different patterns, and we use machine learning to hone on the specific behavioral patterns that are most correlated with fraud. Some of these examples of them are the first and last time we've seen an email address or a phone number. How often are some of the pairs of elements seen together? For example, a shipping address and an email. How many different emails have we seen with one shipping address, etc. So we determine which of these features are most important by experimenting on our own internal ML test bed, which as someone who has been a data scientist is a pretty cool tool that we've developed. And we pair up these signals and we see where a lot of the value in the network features lie through data and through machine learning and experimentation.
Awesome. And why is it so important to have like both sides of the coin here with authoritative and behavioral checks?
Yeah, so knowing the identity elements of a digital identity is only part of the picture. Like someone could easily find a way to get my address, say. So fraudsters can circumvent those authoritative checks fairly easily. So only when you look at the identity of a buyer can their behavior online really indicate the consumer is both who they say they are and acting the way they usually do online.
Okay, so you're saying, for instance, like if a fraudster could steal my name or phone number and address, and he could use it, I don't know why I just presumed it was a he, use it across a variety of merchants in a matter of minutes. Like even though the identity information is technically valid, they might be able to tell that that's very uncharacteristic with my usual digital behavior, like buying things within a matter of minutes. I mean, technically it's more like hours for me than minutes, but is that kind of in line with what?
Yeah, exactly. So clearly a use case here is account takeover, which I know many people have expressed is a current problem you're facing. And, you know, it is a real problem because, the person looks like a cogent individual. You know, they are you for all intents and purposes. They just no longer have to go to a store and look like you. So a man could do that.
Cool.
So to dive a little deeper into this, here's an example of what we look at within the network. So first of all, these three rows they're example transactions. And as you can see, they're not human readable. So to protect personally identifiable information, PII, we push our data through a one-way cryptographic function, meaning that all the PII gets converted into an irreversible 88-character alphanumeric string, as you can see here. This ensures confidentiality of consumer PII, which we take very seriously, while giving us the ability to use machine learning to look for patterns. As you can imagine, if the same string results in the same hash, then we can then aggregate that and say we saw this particular hash over 20 times over the last 30 days.
And do two different values ever result in the same hashed value?
No, they do not. Two different values never result in the same hash value. And using the hash values, like I said, we can look at different patterns. So it's a pretty unique kind of cool tool that we have that also still protects everyone's privacy. And so we have kind of three main behavioral patterns that we're going to talk about today. And just kind of for simplicity's sake, the first one is velocity, which some of you who may use our Pro Insight tool may have seen kind of in action. But velocity basically looks at how many times in a given time slice, we'll say 30 days, an email has been seen in our network. So I personally shop online, say 5 to 10 times a month. But if it registered to 50, that would start looking suspect. And as you can see, we can basically look at these hashes and see that we had this same primary address in 3 transactions in a 5-minute time frame. So I don't usually shop that quickly. Popularity is when we look across a bunch of different merchants and see how many merchants have we seen this particular identity element. So it may be normal to transact across 10 different merchants in a month, but likely not 100. And as you can see, the same primary address was seen in transactions from 3 different merchants. In a 30-day window, that may not be super suspect, but once again, that can, in a 5-minute window, that's, not as practical, unless I guess you have magic autofill abilities and you really want to buy a lot of things very quickly. And this is very useful for us. And as you can also see, we also hash that merchant name. So you will be unable to it's anonymized and not associated with any specific merchant for everyone's privacy. And so finally, volatility, which is kind of one of my favorites. I think it's pretty cool. What looks at how many different permutations these identity elements we've seen together. So if you see 50 different email addresses with one shipping address, that is usually concerning, especially because that's definitely a fraudulent behavior from what I've seen. There's no reason you need 50 different email addresses with one specific shipping address. So we look at kind of all of these different permutations. So how many different phone numbers were with one email address, etc. And as you can see here, what we see is that 3 names are seen with the same primary address and transactions in the last 5 minutes. That's not a super normal buying behavior. So that's something that we see as concerning. And once again, you can kind of aggregate this all using all that hash data. So.
And how can our customers leverage these patterns in their modeling to determine whether or not a transaction is risky or good?
So one of the ways that we have come up with to do that is we've recently built what we call our network score that takes all these patterns into consideration. The score is built on 147 features derived exclusively from our network. So we took a lot of different features based on kind of some of the patterns I'd mentioned earlier with all the different identity elements. And we scientifically picked out the top 147 features that worked well together. And so this score is derived exclusively from our network. So it's based on only behavioral patterns. For example, single and pair dimension features, like I mentioned earlier, velocities across different time slices. And again, all these features are all selected based on their predictive power.
Interesting. And we touched on machine learning modeling and rules-based earlier, but I'm curious, how can our customers best use the network score in either model or both?
Yeah, so first, it's really useful it's kind of very easily digestible in machine learning models, which is great, but it also can be used in a rules flow. And when we couple the network score with the identity graph, we can provide insight into if this person is who they say they are, but also if the person is behaving in a normal way. So examples of how this would be used is because it's numeric, it can be used as simply a feature in a decision tree-based model. And it could also be used in a rules-based system where you potentially compound some other signals that you might use with also a network score is greater than or equal to X value, depending on kind of your individual data.
So you classify like a threshold to say whether it's risky or not.
Yeah.
Your rules. Okay, got it.
And you could also similarly do that with a good customer has X matches and also has a score less than.
Got it.
They're
not risky.
Yeah, 0.6. I'm not sure. It depends totally on customer, but yeah, that's an example.
Awesome. And what are some of the overall benefits that our customers can get using the network score in their models?
Yeah, so the network score further enhances our identity engine's ability to do a bunch of things. First of all, help customers fight fraud, create less friction in the digital customer experience. Like we mentioned, upon onboarding, you could not request a certain authentication or ID upload if you think that this person is really a legitimate and good person that is behaving in a very normal way. You can reduce chargebacks and, of course, reward good customers. So if you know a customer is good, you can treat them extra. Make sure they know their value.
Nice. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Sarah, for walking us through all of that today. And thanks, everyone, for joining us on the webinar. If you are an Ekata customer or are looking to potentially use our identity verification suite within your organization, please feel free to reach out to us after today's webinar if you'd like to learn more about how to use network score and the network within your organization. We'll go ahead and move on to our live Q&A. Please feel free to put questions in the GoToWebinar console, and then we will get started here in just a second. So let's start with this question here. Of the behavioral patterns mentioned earlier, velocity, volatility, and popularity, is there one behavior pattern that Ekata considers to be more indicative of fraud than the others?
Not specifically. They all combine kind of form more of a fraudulent picture. But what I will say is something like volatility is, like I mentioned, if and when we do see something like 50 email addresses with one shipping address, that starts to become very concerning all on its own. Otherwise, a lot of these features together are really what forms that picture. So you will see, it would be not totally crazy for me to make 5 purchases in one day. But if I made 5, or sorry, that's probably not a great enough. But if I made like 10 purchases against 10 different merchants in a small amount of time, then that kind of starts to form a different picture. But you kind of need that all together.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you tell me more, or actually, interesting question here, do you have any experience personally working with handling freight forwarders?
Yeah, so actually, we have a feature in our identity check API actually that is a flag for forwarders. And so that in itself can be quite useful. That is derived based on a combination of information from our graph and kind of our network to kind of know whether something has been used like that in the past. An address, sorry, per se, specifically.
Yeah, awesome. And we're happy to follow up with you afterwards to learn more about what you're trying to solve, I think in regards to the freight forwarder question as well after the presentation. Another question here, can you speak more to how Ekata identifies which features are more predictive than others? I think you touched on it earlier, but can you elaborate?
Yeah, so we do that with kind of machine learning, and what we do is we evaluate the feature, kind of the predictive power of a feature, but also in tandem with other features. So a few features can be super predictive, but they also may end up being somewhat redundant. So it's kind of a combination of actual metrics such as AUC, kind of F1 scores based on precision and recall, as well as when put into a whole model, which ones are kind of the most important in as a whole to kind of and aren't redundant of each other. So there are a few ways you can kind of evaluate redundancy in a model. You can do like one in, one out evaluations, bootstrapping. There are a few different ways. So
awesome. And we have a lot of good questions coming in, but I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. Last question here, is there a phone risk score? Our users register using our app with phone numbers only?
No, we don't have a phone risk score in itself, but we do have the ability to evaluate a phone number and tell you about kind of the riskiness of a phone number.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you everyone for your time and participation today. I want to thank Sarah for joining us as well. If we didn't get to your question, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the presentation today to discuss maybe your use case or what business problem you're trying to solve. And then as a reminder, we will be sharing out the recording and the slides after the live session today is over. So feel free to be on the lookout for that and forward to a colleague as you see fit. Thanks again, everybody, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care. Bye-bye.